When you think of the Book of Revelation, what comes to mind? Probably fire, apocalyptic beasts, prophecy, the end of the world, right? It's the Bible's grand dramatic finale. But what if I told you that the secret history of how this book even got into the Bible is just as wild and controversial as anything in its pages?
I mean, really let that sink in for a second. For hundreds of years, its spot was not guaranteed at all. The journey of Revelation is this incredible story of intense debates, deep divisions, and eventually a total revolution in thinking that basically saved it from the cutting room floor.
So where does the trouble start? Well, the first huge obstacle was a question that sounds pretty simple on the surface. Who actually wrote this thing? The book says it's from a man named John, but figuring out which John, well, that sparked a debate so fierce it almost kept the book out of the official collection of scripture for good.
Now, at first, it seemed like an open and shut case. You had a powerhouse lineup of early church fathers. I'm talking Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, Tertullian, all the heavy hitters. And they all agreed. They were absolutely convinced it was written by John the Apostle, the disciple who literally walked and talked with Jesus. For about 2 centuries, that was pretty much the standard view.
Yeah, not so fast. Because while all the big names were on board, a really strong, really vocal opposition started bubbling up. And they were pointing out some, let's say, very awkward problems with the idea that the Apostle John was the author.
And this conflict was no joke. There was a Roman priest named Gaius who straight up argued it was a forgery, written by a heretic from a rival sect named Cerinthus. Others just thought the symbolism was kind of crude and weird. But the most powerful argument, the one that really stuck, came from a brilliant scholar named Dionysius of Alexandria. He laid it out plain and simple. The Greek language, the grammar, the style of Revelation, it's utterly different from the Gospel of John. His point? There's nowhere the same person wrote both books.
So to try and fix this mess, Dionysius actually came up with a compromise. He suggested, okay, maybe it wasn't the Apostle John, and maybe it wasn't the heretic Cerinthus. What if it was another well-respected church leader who just happened to be named John? The fact that this was a serious theory just shows you how deep the confusion went. Nobody, and I mean nobody, could prove who really wrote it.
And this wasn't just some dusty academic squabble. This doubt about who wrote the book had huge, real-world consequences. It actually fueled this massive geographical split right down the middle of the early Christian world. You had the Latin-speaking West on one side and the Greek-speaking East on the other, and they developed completely different attitudes about Revelation. And I mean, the difference was night and day. In the Latin-speaking West, it was full steam ahead. Revelation was accepted early, it was accepted enthusiastically, it shows up in super important early lists of scripture like the Muratorian canon. But over in the Greek-speaking East, where that whole authorship debate was raging, totally different story. Major church leaders just left it out of their official lists. The famous historian Eusebius even called its status disputed. And get this, to this day, the Eastern Orthodox Church doesn't use Revelation in its public worship services. That's how deep that divide really was.
Okay, so the book's authority is hanging by a thread. How does it survive? Well, this is where things get really interesting. Its place in the Bible was ultimately saved because of a massive shift in how people read it. The book had to be completely reinvented from the ground up.
You see, the original way of reading Revelation was very, very literal. They had this belief called Chiliasm, or millennialism, which held that the 1,000 years mentioned in chapter 20 was a literal, future 1,000-year kingdom ruled by Christ right here on earth. And for the first couple of centuries, that was the main way people understood it.
The first little crack in this literal wall came from a commentator named Victorinus. Now, he still believed in that literal millennium, but he introduced a really key idea called recapitulation. He basically argued that the visions in Revelation weren't a strict chronological timeline. Instead, they were like different camera angles on the same spiritual truths, repeating and reinforcing them. It was a small idea, but it opened a huge door.
And here's the man who kicked that door wide open. Tychonius. He was a North African theologian in the late 4th century. And even though most of his original work is actually lost to history, his ideas completely changed how the Western world read Revelation for the next 800 years.
So here's what he did. He spiritualized everything. First, he argued the church isn't some perfect community of saints, it's a mixed body of good and evil, all jumbled together. Second, and this was the absolute game changer, he said that 1,000-year reign wasn't some future golden age. No, he said it's happening right now. It's a symbol for the entire age of the church from Jesus' first coming to his second. And third, that first resurrection, not about bodies rising from graves, it's about the spiritual rebirth a believer gets in baptism. He took a roadmap to the future and turned it into a symbolic play about the church's present reality.
And you don't have to take my word for it. This quote from a later writer, Gennadius, just nails it. He said Tychonius understood nothing in a carnal sense, but all in a spiritual sense. He completely reframed the book, shifting it away from literal, controversial predictions and turning it into a rich allegory about the soul and the church. And that made it way more acceptable and useful to mainstream theologians.
But here's the thing about a revolutionary idea. It needs champions to make it stick. And Tychonius' spiritual interpretation might have just faded into obscurity if it wasn't for two of the biggest intellectual celebrities in Western history.
Enter Augustine of Hippo and Jerome. I mean, these were arguably the two most influential Christian thinkers of late antiquity. Augustine took Tychonius' spiritual reading and ran with it, making it famous in his masterpiece, City of God. At the same time, Jerome, the guy who translated the whole Bible into Latin, went back and revised earlier commentaries, systematically weeding out all that literal millennium stuff. With the stamp of approval from these two giants, the allegorical reading became the official, undisputed way to see Revelation in the West for centuries to come.
So this table gives you a great little snapshot of that intellectual relay race. You can see the handoff really clearly. Victorinus cracks the door open. Tychonius kicks it down with his new spiritual interpretation. Augustine and Jerome basically make it the law of the land. And then guys like Promysius carry that torch forward, cementing it for the entire Middle Ages.
Okay, so why are we digging through all this ancient history, all these debates and commentaries from 1,500 years ago? Because the incredible journey of this one book tells us something really profound about how we treat all foundational texts.
Just think about that number. For over 800 years, the Western world read the book of Revelation not as a literal timetable for the apocalypse, but as a spiritual drama about the life of the church. This wasn't some fringe theory, it was the mainstream dominant way of thinking, all thanks to that revolution Tychonius started.
And that, right there, is the core lesson. A book's meaning isn't just fixed in stone from the moment it's written. It's a living thing. It gets forged in the fire of debate, of skepticism, and of constant reinterpretation. It's the community of readers who decides what a text means and why it matters. And the secret history of Revelation is maybe the best proof of that you could ever find.
So it leaves us with this final, pretty big question. If the meaning of a book as important as Revelation could be so fluid, so debated, and so radically changed over time, what does that tell us about how we should approach the foundational texts in our own lives today? It really suggests that the act of interpretation, of making meaning, is every bit as important as the text itself.